When this generation Lexus NX launched last year, I was really curious to see which engine would end up being the best seller. Would it be the turbo, would it be the base engine, would it be the hybrid, or the available new plug-in hybrid? And the answer is it is the hybrid. Representing over 38% of all NX sales in the United States, the hybrid is by far the most popular engine, and I'm not including plug-in hybrids in that number. If you're interested in getting a Lexus NX, it looks like you're also interested in saving fuel. But how does that mean that the NX compares with all the rest of the competition? Who is this vehicle right for, and who is it wrong for? What has Lexus done right, and what could they improve on in the next generation? All that's going to be in this video. When the Lexus spindle grille first came on the scene, I wasn't a big fan. It didn't really seem well integrated with the rest of the vehicle. That has definitely changed over time. And now for the Lexus NX, even though the grille is actually a little bit larger than it's been in the past, I think it works better with the rest of the car because the headlights are all focusing in on this little kink right there. Everything, I think, just works better, including from the side profile where the grille actually bends around a little bit. We find full LED headlights in the NX. There are some variations in terms of the front end styling as you work from trim level to trim level. The grille is the biggest thing that changes model to model. One definite thing to keep in mind if you're shopping for an NX is that versus a lot of the European competition, this grille is going to be a little bit more difficult to clean simply due to the size of it. From this angle, you can see how the hood and the sides of the bumper really integrate with that large spindle grille and how it wraps onto the side a little bit. At the bottom of the bumper, we have fog lights, and you'll notice that there's not a lot of chrome going on up front. The grille is surrounded by a charcoal plastic section. Unlike many mainstream crossovers, however, this is not a matte charcoal section. It is a metallic fleck paint, just like we find on the outside in the green section. Moving around to the side, you'll definitely notice that the styling direction is more evolution than revolution. Although this has grown over the outgoing model, this is now 183.5 inches long. Some of the growth happens up front. You'll notice we do have a slightly longer hood, but we still have the same sort of shape going on that we find in other Lexus crossovers right here in the back, with this sort of rounded profile with a little bit of a spoiler right there on top of the hatch. This is now right around the same size as the Mercedes-Benz GLC 300 and about 3 inches shorter than the Acura RDX. As with the front-end design, Lexus really wanted to try and help the design wrap around from the side onto the rear, so you can see how the tail lamp modules start way over there on the side and then wrap all the way around from one side of the vehicle all the way to the other. Moving fully around to the rear, the big thing you'll notice is that we have Lexus spelled out across the back rather than the big L logo. We also don't have any visible exhaust tips at the bottom. They've done a good job really integrating these LED taillights into the design, and they are full LED lamps, so no incandescent elements in this module. Although the door handles look fairly traditional, these now have an electronic latch mechanism. So on the inside here, we just have a button that clicks, and then you pull the door open. The handle doesn't move itself. And on the inside, we also have an electric release. It's that button right there. There is a physical release. If the battery is dead, you simply pull on it to open the door. The electric door handles are part of the standard suite of safety systems and driver assistance systems that we find on the new Lexus NX. And that definitely is different than we see in a lot of the European competition, where a lot of active safety tech is optional, not standard. On the Lexus, pretty much everything is standard, including blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic detection, and if there is something approaching the vehicle in the blind spot, it will prevent you from opening the door on the inside, so that way you don't open the door into oncoming traffic or an oncoming bicycle, etc. That's why we have those electronic latches there. Of course, Lexus also includes features like radar adaptive cruise control standard, something that you still find optional on most German alternatives. For this generation of the Lexus NX, they decided to give us not one, not two, not even three, but 4 all-new drivetrains under this hood. The base engine is now a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine, basically borrowed out of the RAV4. It produces 203 horsepower and 184 pound-feet of torque. You'll find that only in the base trim of Lexus NX. That gives you an 8-speed automatic transmission and 28 miles per gallon combined, whether you choose front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. Then there's the 2.4-liter turbo, which I honestly thought was going to be the best-selling engine in the NX. It turns out it's actually second best-selling. That one is a new engine. It produces 275 horsepower and 311 pound-feet of torque. All-wheel drive is the only way that one comes, and you'll get 25 miles per gallon combined. Next, we have the drivetrain we're all here to talk about, the all-new hybrid system. This is based around a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine. The engine in its own right produces 189 horsepower if you get the NX without the plug. If you get it with the plug, for some reason, horsepower drops down to 181 horsepower. This is a 3-motor hybrid system, so we have the usual 2-motor setup up front, and then we have a separate motor in the rear for all-wheel drive. The interesting twist here is that this hybrid system was not really borrowed out of the RAV4, but rather the Highlander, because this is more powerful than the hybrid system that we find in the RAV4. It produces 239 horsepower and will give you 39 miles per gallon. If you're interested in getting your hands on the fastest NX available, that's going to be the plug-in hybrid system, which hopefully we'll be able to give a full review to a little bit later this year. That's going to give you 302 horsepower, 36 miles per gallon, and 37 miles of electric range. The hybrid system itself is basically the same as in this vehicle, only everything has been bumped up a bit. The biggest difference is in the battery pack. This is approximately a 1 to 1.5 kilowatt hour battery pack. You get a much larger one in the plug-in hybrid system, and because it has a larger battery pack, the battery can deliver more power. So 181 horsepower comes from the engine, the rest all comes from the battery pack in that model. Although there are a few mechanical changes to the hybrid system internally, the big change is the battery pack, and that's how it goes 0 to 60 so much faster. In 6 seconds flat, this one will take 7.1. One of the obvious reasons that the hybrid sells so well is that math is certainly on the side of the hybrid. The base Lexus NX with the just over 200 horsepower engine and all-wheel drive starts at $41,025. The hybrid, $42,625. So it is a bit of a bump, but you're going to pay that back in about 2.5 years on average, because this is going to save you $600 a year on gasoline. And the NX 350 all-wheel drive turbo model, well, that's actually going to be more expensive than this, starting at $43,025. So your savings start the day that you roll it off the lot. Lexus has long been laser focused on reliability, and as with a strong focus on anything, there are pros and cons. Obviously, long-term reliability and long-term maintenance costs are the pro. The con is that we don't generally find quite as many electronic gadgets, goodies, and gizmos in modern Lexuses as you might find in some of the European competition. Front seat design is definitely an area where we notice a difference. We do have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and 3-position memory with a powered tilt telescopic steering column, but we don't find things like front seat massage or an extending thigh cushion or inflatable side bolsters, etc. And unlike most of the European luxury competition, the front passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It's missing the memory and it's missing the 4-way lumbar support. So if you're frequently traveling with a passenger that expects the same level of comfort as you have while you're driving, definitely keep that in mind. Lexus has a lot of experience packaging battery packs in hybrid systems, and it really shows. The battery pack is right here under the rear seats, but if you weren't told that, you'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between this and a regular gasoline Lexus NX. Now, the rear seat is a little bit different, but again, unless you have them side by side, you'd be hard-pressed to tell. Now, I don't have too much headroom back here. I could wish for a little bit more headroom. This model does have the large panoramic moonroof, but if I put my head back to the headrest, I don't actually quite fit there. If I move over to the middle seating position, you can definitely tell my head is touching the seat. I have to crane it to one side in order to fit back here. Over on the right side, you'll start to notice that the NX is a little bit smaller than average. At 77.1 inches of combined legroom with this front seat comfortably adjusted for a 6'5" passenger, I have about 1.5 inches of legroom left. And you will certainly find more legroom in the Acura RDX, about 3 inches more in that one, 4 inches more in the Lincoln Corsair, and 5 inches more if you get the next size category up in the Lexus lineup. That would be the Lexus RX. Speaking of the Lexus RX, if you're thinking about the NX as a family luxury vehicle where you intend to put child seats or mixed child seats and adults in the back, you probably want to step up to the RX because you're going to find a lot more room behind the driver, especially if you're a taller person up front. In this vehicle, it's a little bit too tight to put a rear-facing child seat behind a 6-foot-tall driver up front, and you could do that in the RX. Rear seat passengers get 2 air vents in the center console, heated rear seats in this model, and some USB charge-only ports. The rear seats also offer a 2-stage recline, but it's not much of one. You can see the difference here between that 60% side and this 40% side. You only have about 1.5 inches of movement, and it's simply a 2-step. You either have it up or you have it back. The cargo cover is a mesh style cover rather than a roller style, but unlike some, it simply folds in half, and these are rigid elements on the sides. It's not one of those kind where you have to try and coil it up into a ball or anything like that. It does have a storage slot right here under the load floor. It'll snap into place and stay out of the way. Under the load floor, some of you might be disappointed to find that we don't have a spare tire in here, something that we have found in a lot of Toyota and Lexus hybrids in the past. Instead, they just give us a sectionable storage area. So there are multiple storage bins right there. And over on the left side of the cargo area, we find where they put the 12-volt battery. As we look around the interior, you should know that this is almost a fully loaded hybrid model. So obviously there are going to be things in here that you won't find in the base version. We have this large panoramic moonroof that spans to just about the rear passenger's laps. The driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests. The NX gets a new front seat design that is thinner yet more comfortable than the outgoing model. You can see that we have perforations on the seat upholstery for the seat back and seat bottom cushion. That's because these seats are both heated and ventilated, but bolstering is fairly minor here. So if you're looking for a seat that really grips and holds you into place, you might want to look elsewhere, but if you want something that feels a little bit more comfortable, a little bit less confining, you might want this particular design. Unlike more expensive Lexus models, the doors are the only place you'll find wood trim, right next to those very organically shaped Mark Levinson speaker grills. Obviously, the Mark Levinson system is optional. Above the soft touch armrest, we find all soft touch materials. We find harder plastics to improve durability down there at the bottom. Here's another view of the electric door release, and you can see we have stitched material all around that armrest to make it definitely more comfortable. The dashboard itself is a standard injection molded model, so no stitched leather, no stitched pleather going on for the main portion of the dash. Under the injection molded section, we find harder plastics just as you'd expect, and a very large bin-style glove compartment. I had no problem fitting an 11-inch tablet computer inside. Without a doubt, the star of the show in here is this large 14-inch touchscreen infotainment system. As you can see, it supports wireless Apple CarPlay, but CarPlay does not use the entire screen. When in this mode, the lower portion of the screen is reserved simply for climate control functions, as well as a few direct shortcuts. So I can click that, and I can turn on and off these frequently used options here, or those comfort and convenience options right there. I can also just close that, and it pops right back to Apple CarPlay. If I exit CarPlay, you'll notice that some system functions occupy just the top of the screen, like settings right there, but if I go over to the mapping interface, it actually expands that out, and only this very low bottom strip is used for the climate control. Now, right behind these knobs, you'll see the temperature right there. That's actually part of the LCD, and the knob is glued right on top, like we find in a Mustang Mach-E. Rather unfortunately, this screen is not standard in the NX. This is optional, and there are a few other things you should know. If you want the factory navigation to function after a limited trial time, the trial time will vary depending on the screen size you get, you will have to continue to pay for that option. This is mapping basically supplied by Google, so we have Google mapping data, things like traffic information right like that, but it's then run through the Lexus servers, so it has a very distinctive Lexus-like look, rather than looking like the Android automotive systems that we find in some of the competition. But probably the biggest thing to keep in mind is that this large LCD is not standard in the NX, it is optional. Outside the LCD's bezel, we find the power button. We find a few more physical controls right down here along the bottom for the front defroster, volume, and then the rear defogger right there. We also find the autonomous parking system button, 360-degree camera button that engages the augmented reality camera right there on top, 2 large air vents, and the hazard light button as well. Like it or not, Lexus has gone for a very style-forward interior. The way that this LCD pops out of the dashboard there, and the way the dashboard itself sort of zigzags around the car is definitely very distinctive. Over here we find the drive mode controller. We rotate it that way for sport, rotate it counterclockwise for eco, press in the middle for normal. We have a Qi wireless charging mat right there, 2 USB connections. One interfaces with the system, one is charge only. There's also a very small slot right in front, not quite big enough for some large smartphones there, but you can push that out of the way and have access to even more storage under there. And you can do that while a smartphone is in the tray. You can push it away. We also have 2 large cup holders right there in the center console, a joystick style shifter. So we put our foot on the brake, pull to the left and then down for drive, pull to the left and then forward for reverse. Sport mode is just straight back. Park is that button right there. Behind the shifter, we find the auto brake hold button, EV mode button, basically an off-road terrain button, stability and traction control button, and then electric parking brake release. Between the front seats, we find a padded armrest. There's a button on either side because it opens 2 ways. You can open it there for the passenger or that way for the driver. Under there, we find a moderately sized storage compartment, definitely a little bit bigger than we find in the average rear-wheel drive option. Above the instrument cluster, we have a full-color heads-up display, but it's not quite as large as the one that we find in the LS. Oddly enough, however, the LCD instrument cluster is the same size as the one that we find in the LS, which is a little on the small side, to be honest, especially when you can get something like a Kia Sportage with a large 12.3-inch LCD cluster. This is approximately 7 inches in size, and it's flanked by LED digital gauges on either side. The LCD cluster is not terribly configurable. You can get turn-by-turn navigation directions, things like the status of the vehicle's active safety software as well. And if I put the vehicle in sport mode, you'll get a tachometer rather than the power and charge gauge. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with sport grips up top and a split bottom spoke down there. We have paddles on the back for shifting, down on the left and up over there on the right. If at first glance these controls are confusing, let me explain what's going on. You'll notice there are no icons on this button bank, and that's because this vehicle has the optional heads-up display. So on the heads-up display, you'll see what exactly I'm touching as I'm moving around that button module, and the button module will swap functions by the press of the button just below it. The same thing happens for the button module on the left side of the steering wheel. So this left button module can function as either track forward, backward, phone hang up, pickup, or voice command, or if I press this button on the bottom, it becomes mode, mute, and then track forward, backward again. Volume up and down are over there, of course. On this side of the steering wheel, this button flip-flops between cruise control controls and then controls for the heads-up display or the multifunction LCD cluster. Out on the road, this NX went 0 to 60 in 7.1 seconds. That is really quite similar to the RAV4 hybrid's 0 to 60 time. You might be wondering why, since this hybrid system produces more power than the one that we find in the RAV4. It's mainly because the NX is heavier than the RAV4. All the luxury amenities that we find in here, the extra cushioning in the seats, the better leather, the squishier dash bits, the extra sound deadening, the wider tires, etc., all of that adds curb weight, and that's why even though we have more power, we have basically the same 0 to 60 time. In terms of 60 to 0 stopping distances, this one came in at 125 feet. That's a respectable distance, although you should know that the brake pedal feel in here is not quite as good as some of the hybrid competition from the Europeans, like the Audi Q5 hybrid, the Volvo XC60 hybrid. I think they handle blended braking a little bit better. The time you're really going to notice it in the NX is if you're braking moderately and then you transition from moderate braking to heavy braking. There can be a little bit of a moment where the braking system is trying to decide what's going on, and it can be a little bit disconcerting. Now, that is not as prominent as the first generation NX hybrid, but it still exists to a lesser extent here in this model. Now, about these paddle shifters here, this is something that Lexus has done in their hybrid models in the past. These are imitation gear shifts because this doesn't really have a transmission in the traditional sense. Some folks mistakenly say that this has a continuously variable transmission under the hood. That is not technically correct. Lexus describes it as a planetary power split system. That's the best way to describe it because it's really not a CVT, it's not a transmission even in the traditional sense. There is one planetary gear set, two electric motors, and that whole combination together sort of acts like a transmission. The big thing to know about this drivetrain is that the larger of the two electric motors under the hood is always going to be moving the vehicle forward. And that's why, honestly, this feels more like an electric car than a traditional vehicle with a traditional CVT. Some of the engine power is flowing mechanically across from the engine through the planetary gear set to the wheels, but a decent portion is flowing electrically from the engine to one motor generator unit to the other and then to the wheels. Even if you're not a fan of CVTs, you might still be a fan of this hybrid system because it doesn't have that same sort of rubber bandy feel that we find in other CVTs. And thanks to the electric motor, it also has a decent amount of low-end torque. So if I come to a complete stop here, for instance, and then floor it, you don't have that delay in power that you find in the average CVT. We get a lot more instant acceleration. This vehicle has the ability to have a much broader gear ratio spread mechanically between the engine and the wheels than any modern CVT. That's also what's going on there. And then, of course, if you're just tootling along and you floor it, you're also going to notice more instant acceleration thanks to that electric motor. In terms of handling ability, I would also put the Acura RDX with all-wheel drive just a little bit above the NX. It has that torque vectoring rear axle. And the Volvo XC60, thanks to its general design, I would also put just a little bit above this, depending on the version you're looking at. Now, the only hybrid in the Volvo lineup is the plug-in hybrid, and their handling is going to be a little bit unusual. It's going to be a bit more predictable, actually, here in the NX. When Lexus launched the initial NX, they said that their mission with that model was to sort of complement the Lexus IS. Even though this has never been a rear-wheel drive crossover, they wanted the styling and the driving nature to be a little bit more similar to the IS, whereas the Lexus RX was teamed more with a combination of GS and ES. So this was a little bit firmer at the beginning, and it is still a little bit firmer now, even though Lexus is not quite drawing that same parallel. The reason, of course, is obvious because this is the direct competitor to the BMW X3, the Mercedes-Benz GLC, the Volvo XC60, etc., all of those European options, and those tend to be tuned a little bit firmer than the Lexus RX. Now, this generation NX is a little bit different than the first generation because on a bumpier road like this gravel road that we're on here, I actually find this to be more compliant than the first NX. And I think that makes sense because Lexus realized that what a lot of their shoppers seemed to be interested in was in fact a slightly scaled down version Lexus RX, not really the overtly sportiest option in the group. And that's logically why the fastest version of the NX is that plug-in hybrid version. So if you're looking for an option in this segment that's going to be a bit more comfortable out on longer highway drives while still being very efficient, that's why you might want to take a look at the NX. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 71.5 decibels at 50 miles an hour, meaning this is right in the thick of things for the compact crossover segment. You're certainly going to find a few options that are quieter, but you'll also find a few options that are a bit louder. As with other vehicles in the Lexus and Toyota portfolio that receive a very similar hybrid system to this, sometimes the engine can sound a little bit gruff, and because of the way this is going to hang out at specific RPMs as you're hill climbing, you're definitely going to hear more of that in the cabin under acceleration than you would in, say, the NX with the 2.4-liter turbo. Now, personally, I'm not disturbed by that, but if you are, you might want to get the turbo instead. As is typical for Lexus hybrids, this seems to punch a little bit above its weight when it comes to fuel economy. I've been averaging 39.5 MPG over a week of mixed driving, and that's definitely a little bit above the 39 EPA score. Unlike some hybrid systems out there, the Lexus hybrid systems often give you a very similar rating or identical rating for city and highway mileage, and that really helps keep this at a high level whether you're doing a lot of stop and go or slow and go traffic, or you're just steady state cruising out on the highway. Bottom lining the NX out on the road is honestly pretty easy. This is certainly a refinement, not a complete reinvention of what made the original NX such a sales success. Fuel economy is high, it's easy to live with, it's likely going to be very reliable, it's also very comfortable out on the road, but they have refined around the corners the areas where people complained. The engine refinement, the sound in the cabin, etc. Those are definite improvements over the first generation. On the other hand, if you were hoping that this NX would take driving dynamics to the next level, you might be a little bit disappointed, but that was honestly never the mission of the NX to begin with. In order to keep the YouTube algorithm happy, you'll now find pricing and comparisons in a second video. Just watch this all the way to the end, hit the pricing and comparison button on the lower right-hand side of your screen. In the meantime, be sure to hit the subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen as well if you haven't already done so. Find us over at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those other social places, and we'll see you over there in part 2.